This is for the final poem in the group. It's What Were They Like?, which is written about the Vietnam War by Denise Levertov, who was a born British, but grew up and lived in America. So for the context, the Vietnam War began as a civil war with North Vietnam, which wanted to be communist, and South Vietnam, which didn't, as they achieved independence from the French Empire. However, America was very concerned about the rise of communism and the spread of communism in the eastern half of the globe. They were concerned. China was already very communist, and they saw China as an enemy, and they were concerned about something they called the domino effect, which was this idea that one country would fall to communism, and then the next door country would become communist, and so on, like a load of dominoes falling down. And that these countries, because they were communist, would as necessity be American enemies. So they decided to intervene in this civil war in Vietnam, and take the side of the South Vietnamese, who didn't want to be communist, against the North, who did. So their involvement began in 1965 and continued until 1975. The poem was written in 1967. Now, there was a huge amount of opposition in America to their involvement in the Vietnam War, particularly among young people. There was a big movement to say that this is wrong, it's the other side of the world from us, it's none of our business, our young men are being sent and dying in huge numbers, we're doing immeasurable damage to the Vietnamese people, why are we even there? And Levertov, the writer, is very much in that vein. She's a very strong opponent of the Vietnam War. It's worth knowing that the Viet Cong forces, these are the North Vietnamese forces, mostly fought a guerrilla war. So instead of fighting on battlefields where they could be seen out in the open, they hid in the jungle and would set bombs off as cars drove over them, or they would attack from hiding, which meant they were very difficult to be fought against. And so the American troops had to, or they felt they had to, destroy areas where people lived. So they would go into villages and they wouldn't be able to tell which of the people in the villages were peasants and which ones were Viet Cong fighters. So they would just destroy the lot. They also invented this weapon called napalm, which was essentially liquid petrol, or petrol is liquid, so it was petrol, but it was set on fire and then dropped from the aeroplanes, and the idea was that it would burn off huge swathes of the jungle, so the Viet Cong had fewer places to hide from the American forces. But of course, the thing about fire is that you can't control it, so it caused immeasurable damage to people and their livelihoods, as well as burning out where the Viet Cong were. Another thing to know about from the point of view of context is that Vietnam had a largely oral culture at this time. They hadn't really written down their history. They didn't really have books containing their version of fairy stories. It was all told by one generation to the next generation, which meant that with the disruption and the destruction of the war, a lot of their history and culture was lost. So the poem tries to look at that, as well as at the wider sense of the death and destruction caused by the war. So the story of the poem is that you have a person, probably an American, but we're not told. It's very universal. It's two personas adopted. It's nothing to do with the writer herself. She puts these characters on. And probably an American on the one hand, possibly somebody who's in the military, a soldier or a general, asks a series of questions about Vietnamese people and culture, and a Vietnamese then tries to answer, but rather than give them proper answers, they say, the thing is, we don't know, because what has happened has damaged our culture as well as our people, so I can't answer that question. And it's mostly quite a calm, but very, at the same time, angry tone. So although it doesn't sound aggressive, it sounds quite flat. There's a real sense of anger behind the words. In terms of form and structure, it's written in free verse, and it has the two stanzas. The first stanza is all the questions. The second stanza is all the answers, and they're numbered to go with each other. So you can read it all the questions and all the answers, or you can read it as a question and answer format. Question 1, answer 1, question 2, answer 2, and so on. And maybe this sort of slightly odd format reflects the disruption to life that the Vietnamese people had suffered. The key themes in this poem are things like loss, the loss of culture, the loss of innocence, loss of lives, obviously, the idea of destruction, things being destroyed, actual things, and also less tangible things like your history and your culture, and a sort of lack of understanding by the American questioner. There's a sense that that questioner doesn't know very much about things and is a bit kind of patronising in their approach. So the title, What Were They Like, and the opening of the questions, did they, were they, all of them in the past tense, seem to suggest that Vietnam is no longer really a place, which of course is not true, but perhaps it reflects a lack of care, maybe, by the questioner, whoever that is. Equally, the splitting of Vietnam is incorrect. So maybe, again, that shows that they don't care enough to research it, or they don't know enough, or perhaps it's reflecting the structure of a poem with being split into all the questions and then all the answers. We've got lots and lots of quite sort of stereotypical questions. It's as if the questioner has absorbed some thoughts about what Far Eastern culture is like, and they maybe know a bit about Japanese culture, or they've heard this about Chinese culture, or they think it's like this in Thailand, and they've assumed that it's the same in Vietnam. So they ask these questions, which might be genuinely interested, but they're also quite stereotypical and possibly a bit patronising, as if to say, well, aren't all those Far Eastern cultures exactly the same? So we have these questions, and then we move to the answers. I want to just draw your attention to question 6. Did they distinguish between speech and singing? And that to me is a very patronising question. The language sounds, it's a tonal language, so it sounds a bit like singing to a Western ear. It doesn't sound like individual words. But that's not, there is definitely a difference between speech and singing nonetheless, and that's ignorant on the Western questioner's part, rather than the fact that they just sing everything, or they don't have singing, which is what's implied in the question. Moving on to the answers, you can see that I've got wiggly red lines several times, and my point with that is I wanted to underline bits where words are about uncertainty or lack of confident knowledge or vagueness, and this is a theme that's quite commonly appearing in the poem, and I think that's because she wants to make the point that because it's an oral culture and because things have been disrupted, they just don't know what it was like, because it wasn't written down in the way that perhaps our history has been written down. So if we look at the questions themselves, did the people of Vietnam use lanterns of stone? And then the response is, sir, their light heart turned to stone. So you've got that strong juxtaposition, haven't you, between light hearts and stone, which of course is heavy. You've got the use of the word sir, which is obviously very formal and polite. It makes me wonder whether perhaps the questioner is an American general or a soldier, something like that. It's deference. It goes on, it is not remembered, first example of this sort of vague answer. It is not remembered whether in gardens stone lanterns illumined pleasant ways. Question 2, did they hold ceremonies to reverence the opening of buds? So in Japan, for example, they have cherry blossom days where everybody, because the blossom is so beautiful, it's one of their kind of national things they look for, spring festival. So there's an assumption that maybe the Vietnamese did the same. And that word again, perhaps. They gathered once to delight in blossom, but after their children were killed, there were no more buds. So the use of buds to describe children, there's a metaphor there, isn't there, that the children are like buds in springtime. And when the children have been killed in great numbers by the war, nobody wants to celebrate the spring. They don't want to celebrate hope, because hope has gone when the children have died. Question 3, were they inclined to quiet laughter? And that very strong, quite angry sounding response. Sir, laughter is bitter to the burned mouth. The sort of monosyllabic and very statementy sound of that makes it feel cross, along with the alliteration on the B, which creates a harsh and quite aggressive sound. Question 4 asks about whether they used natural materials to make beautiful things. And the answer goes on, a dream ago perhaps. Ornament is for joy. So we've got this idea that when they were happy, perhaps they did, but it feels like it was a dream. It feels like it's so far in the past, it's just a memory and we can't really remember it clearly. And she says all the bones were charred. So we've got the question about whether they used bone. Bones were charred, and that ties in, doesn't it, with the idea of bombs and fire, and particularly perhaps with this napalm weapon that was being used and burning huge swathes of land and enormous numbers of people. Question 5, had they an epic poem? Epic poems are things like the Odyssey in Greek mythology, like Beowulf. So these are long poems that cover lots of years of fighting and war and marriages and children being born and that sort of thing. And lots of cultures have one that's been passed down through generations and generations, and it kind of sums up their culture. And they go, well, I don't know. I don't remember it. It is not remembered. Remember, and that sort of repetition there draws our attention to what we're being told. It's not remember, but hey, you need to notice this. Remember, most were peasants. Their life was rice and bamboo. So you've got this, you need to be aware that these were very peaceful, farming people. They weren't soldiers, and there's a real contrast to the soldiers who were bombing them and hurting them. And then we have this description of what life was like before the war, and it's a very peaceful, sort of slow description of something that's been going on for centuries and centuries. And it's added to by the sibilance, which makes it very slow to read, but also perhaps reflects the sound of the water in the paddy fields. That's where you grow rice, in fields that they flood with water. That's where rice likes to grow. When peaceful clouds were reflected in the paddies and the water buffalo stepped surely along terraces, maybe fathers told their sons old tales. So you can hear that S sounding like the water and slowing it all down. Water buffalo, this reference here, is saying that they pulled their ploughs with animals, with big cows or oxen. They don't have tractors and things. It's not a modern enough society for that. And then you have that awful contrast, that juxtaposition, which is very shocking. When bombs smashed those mirrors, there was time only to scream. And the word mirrors there is supposed to be about the paddy fields reflecting the sky, because they're peaceful and they don't flow like rivers. They're like kind of like very shallow lakes, I suppose. So they would work as a mirror. But there's also the reference to 7 years bad luck that comes with the idea of smashing a mirror, and that word, of course, is very onomatopoeic, isn't it, and aggressive. Question 6, the final one, talks about speech and singing. We've already talked about whether that's a comfortable question. And it goes, there is an echo yet of their speech, which was like a song. It was reported that their singing resembled the flight of moths in moonlight. Who can say? It is silent now. So we've got a question here, kind of reverted back upon the questioner. A bit of a rhetorical question at the end of the question is asked this question and they go, well, I don't know. Who can say? Who can answer this? And then that very final, short, simple, quite abrupt ending. It is silent now. And it tells us again, doesn't it, that These people have had their lives so turned upside down, so disrupted, that there's no noise at all. It's silent. So there's no speech, no singing, nothing. And it really reminds us of the damage that's been done. In terms of what we compare this one to, I think it goes quite well with War Photographer, because both of these poems are about the suffering of ordinary people in war, and the way that perhaps those who aren't fully involved in that war can misinterpret it or misunderstand it or only see a little bit. As the War Photographer says, you can only see the bit that's in that moment. You don't see what happens outside the frame. So they're a good combination. Poppies, it goes quite well with, because they're both poems about loss. Poppies is a personal loss of her own son. This one sort of contrasts with a national loss. So you can say that Poppies is about personal loss. This one's about the loss of a sort of on a national scale. About individual people, about those that they loved, about their culture and about their history.